Hey, Bruce.
Hey, Mickey.
Good to talk to you.
Thanks for having me.
This is Marcos Melitza's worst nightmare. I actually looked up, I Googled Daily Kos and DLC, and I came up with what the latest thing he'd written about you, or the thing that got the most Google hits, which is that the DLC is an aider and abettor of right-wing smear attacks against Democrats. They will brook no calls for truce, and they're going to make the DLC radioactive. So there you go. You're not popular with the net Russe.
Oh, well, we have a lot more in common than they realize. So,
have you made peace with them at all?
Oh, I think that we've been in a calm, and I do think that the frustration that the Netroots feels is something that all of us who do democratic politics for a living also feel in spades. So I think that there's nothing wrong that winning an election wouldn't fix.
Yeah, well, that's not Marcos Melitza's specialty. He has an unblemished record. Well, our first topic of the day is immigration reform, which I've been writing prolifically and not very coherently about. I looked up on the DLC website just a few minutes ago to see what the DLC's position is, and it says here that you're for balanced, comprehensive, a fair but tough-minded approach. I hate that. It seems. Tell me what's wrong with this position. My position is, yes, we want the big compromise of you tighten the borders and then you can do something to legalize the people who are already here, or most of them on compassionate grounds. But why do we have to do them simultaneously? Isn't the obvious thing to do is to get tough on enforcement first, crack down on employers mainly, that's the most important thing, but maybe build a border fence or have some other means of interdicting people at the border, and then wait a couple of years and see if it works. If a labor shortage develops, you can have a temporary guest worker program, but then in a few years, once people have confidence it works, then you can start being compassionate.
Well, I think that there's no reason why we have to choose between doing those two things. I think both of them are very difficult to do, and the sooner we get started on any kind of aggressive effort, the better off we'll be. And I think they're, in some ways related, but related questions that aren't necessarily contingent on each other's success. I mean, I think that obviously we have to figure out a way to police the border in an effective manner, and we can't just pretend that there aren't 7 million people here illegally. So I think that I never want to criticize this Congress for trying to do too much. That's that's not usually their problem. And I'd be surprised if they're able to reach agreement on solving either side of the equation.
I guess I analogize everything to welfare reform, and that may be my downfall. But first, it seems to me they are contingent, because if you do both, if you grant the legalization and you toughen the borders, but one of them doesn't work, then you have a replay of the '86 reform, where we just attract a whole bunch of other people into the country who have said, hey, they're legalized, they're giving amnesty in the United States, so if we get in now, we'll get the amnesty 10 years down the road. If you can't keep those people out, then we're just going to have not 12 million, but 30 million illegal immigrants in 10 years. The same thing that happened after the '86 reform.
Well, I think if we can't succeed in policing the border and keeping people who aren't supposed to be here out, then both sides of the equation are going to fail. But I don't think that that's an argument against coming up with a system to make sure that the people who are already here have to live by some rules, and if they're going to be staying here, that they have to assimilate. I think that it's going to take a long time to figure out whether border enforcement can work. It's gone. When we came into office in the early '90s, it was in bad shape, and we put a lot more resources into it and a lot more effort. And Clinton made it a big priority, and it improved. But it is a. I don't think that the people who are coming here are coming because people before them were granted amnesty by some bill. I think they're coming here because we're not doing an effective job of policing the border, and there are there's plenty of reasons why, given the choice with no impediments, you pick a life here over a life in Mexico.
But that's a good point. It just seems to me that it's a little like, with welfare reform, you said, hey, let's do the compassionate thing and give people on welfare elaborate training and help them find good jobs, but then you're just attracting more people onto welfare in the first place. Similarly, if you say, hey, not only are you going to get to work here, but you're going to get citizenship and go to our schools and become an American with all the benefits of being an American, that has to do something to attract more people. And that is, in fact, the historical record of what happened after '86.
Well, look, if you take the long view, the goal is to figure out a rational immigration regime so that the people who are coming here to be on a path to citizenship. I don't think over the long haul, that's always been the best thing for America. And if you look down the road 20 or 30 years, all the industrialized nations are going to be fighting over who gets the immigrants and which immigrants they get.
Well, and according to some people, Mexico will be one of them, that they're going to have be a net importer of people.
Yeah,
because the birth rate is falling so rapidly.
That could well be. So there's a million reasons why tougher border security makes sense. Some of it having nothing to do with immigration, simply having to do with homeland security. But I think it is important for assimilation not to be lost in this whole deal. It is one of the most important things for a country as diverse as ours is to make sure that we don't end up like Europe, where we have pockets of foreigners who are not part of the mainstream experience. I think that's the real downside of having a bunch of unassimilated illegal immigrants, is that that there are obviously economic consequences from it, but really, we should aspire to a time when everybody who's in America we can all think of as Americans, and I think that we supported the compromise that came out last week, in even though it had some provisions that some Democrats didn't like, in part because we think that's an important part of this whole debate. It's not. It's important to send a signal to people that you can't just walk right over the border and
right.
there be no consequences. But it's also important to send a signal to immigrants in America and people who are looking at America that we're that we are an inclusive country with a lot of room for people, provided that we can make sure that we're a nation of laws.
Right, but isn't it possible? This is something that I don't know what's going to happen, but isn't it possible that I agree with all those requirements, and especially English, but isn't it possible that we'll have enough requirements, and it won't take a lot, so that nobody will take this earned citizenship deal? In other words, you have a fine, you have to learn English, you have to do X, Y, and Z, and these people aren't rich, and they'll say, hey, I'm doing okay here living as an illegal.
Well, I think that's possible. And I think that it was kind of hastily drawn compromise, and there were a lot of questions about whether it would actually work. I think the spirit of it was good, and I do think that the likeliest outcome here is that we don't do anything about toughening enforcement, and that we don't do anything about making sure that people who are already here assimilate, and that's a bad result. And you could make an argument that if compared to doing nothing, we'd be better off doing either of those things. But I think that the issue is so divisive in both parties that it's worth holding people's feet to the fire to try to come up with something that addresses both of those issues, even if it's not perfect. Right.
Most people seem to think nothing's going to happen this year, but why isn't, to continue the analogy with welfare reform, in the equivalent period, day in 1996, there was going to be no welfare bill, and then as we got close to the elections, the Republicans said, Jesus, we better pass something or else the voters are going to be mad at us. And then they passed something, and they reduced their maximalist demands.
Well, I think that can happen.
Why isn't the obvious thing to happen is they agree on the one thing they can agree on, which is tough enforcement, and then they have some vague language about all the goodies that the people currently here are going to get, and then they pass it, and so the Republicans have something to show for their tenure.
Well, I think it's possible that they would do that. I think that I think that it's always better to make big changes like this with broad support from both sides, not just with one party or the other putting its finger on or its thumb on the scale. And I just am not as concerned as you are about that setting in place a regime that actually requires people to assimilate and earn citizenship and learn English is a soft message of some sort. I think that's a tough message too. And I think just saying that we're going to get serious about enforcing the border is putting a lot of eggs in one basket and not necessarily making a particularly smart bet that it will work.
But you could pass a bill saying, and when a lot of conservatives, this is the right-wing position now, and it's a reasonable position, we toughen up the border, and then in 2 years, if it looks like the border's been toughened and illegals aren't getting in, then we do these prearranged steps to let people who are here legalize. And you could write that in the original bill, it just wouldn't go into effect simultaneously. I mean, that's an obvious compromise.
Yeah. Well, I think we saw in the Senate last week that it's not impossible to drop a compromise, at least on the Senate side. Nobody really knows how dug in the House is on this issue, and as you say, how desperate they are to get something done for the year.
I would say the key question is how dug in the Senate is, and because the Senate, the reason this isn't like welfare reform is because in welfare reform the Senate wanted to act and the House was balking, and once the House decides to act, action happens. But the Senate is very good at balking. It's designed to balk. It's insulated from political pressures. It's heavily indebted to big employers, and it seems to me that the danger is that they'll, dig their heels in.
Well, I think that the Republicans are in an incredibly weakened position at the moment in enforcing party discipline, which has been their whole theory of the case for the past 6 years has been to get by with only their own votes, and have the president and Tom DeLay squeeze hard, and they're now in a position where they got a very weak president and a new guy running the House, and they have a number of somewhat endangered members in the Senate. So it's and a Senate leader who's after another job. So I think it is. It's hard to say whether everybody's going to be looking out for the same interests.
All right. This brings us to our second topic. I'm going to ring the symbolic bell, which tells us where to break it, which is the politics of this all. I think the new congealing conventional wisdom is that the Republicans are hurt by this because the House bill, which is very tough, alienates Latinos, a growing voter group, and the Senate bill, which is very liberal, demoralizes the Republican base, so they won't come out to vote in the midterms. Why isn't exactly the opposite the case? Why doesn't the tough House bill energize the base, and the liberal Senate bill for the long term shows Latinos that not all Republicans are the vicious draconian House members? And since that's a long-term thing, the elections are short-term, they're happening this fall, I don't see why House Republicans aren't helped by having a tough enforcement-only bill. I don't see why this hurts them in the midterms. In fact, it could be the base galvanizing issue that, gay marriage was last time.
I think that that the Republicans' best interest, speaking from strictly a political point of view, is to get something done. I think that incumbents always do better when they get things done than when they fail to get things done.
Right.
And I don't think that I don't think the Republican base is gonna. Right now, I think the Republican base is extremely discouraged by the inability of the Congress and the administration to run a two-car funeral. And so, if immigration turns out to be just another issue that they can't accomplish anything on, I do think that probably is a net negative for the Republicans. Nobody knows. Nobody knows whether this is an issue that is burning on the minds of voters in swing districts or not. And midterms are inherently unpredictable. But I think the nightmare scenario for Republicans is one in which immigration is really just a bit player. It's what they're potentially facing this fall, which we faced in November of '94, is a nationalizing of the election where an awful lot of people come to the conclusion that these guys don't know what they're doing, can't get their agenda through, and that discourages one side and emboldens the other.
Right. Well,
the effect on the Hispanic voters is much harder to predict. You'll recall that in '96, when Republicans forced us to accept deep cuts in immigrant benefits as part of welfare reform, the Republicans got hammered in the Latino vote in November, the Republican Party has under Bush has tried harder to send a different message, but I think that there is no upside in this whole deal for Republicans unless they can accomplish something. If they accomplish something, then probably the positive outweighs the negative.
Well, you raised an interesting question, which is, I'm hounded by the experience of the past decade. How are the Democrats going to blow it this time? There must be some way they can figure out to lose. All the polls are very much in their favor. There was a poll recently that showed, not only are the Democrats 10 points ahead in the generic who do you prefer to control Congress, but all the intensity, which is supposed to be the key in midterms, is on the Democratic side. 47% of the people intensely think Bush is doing a bad job. The Republicans sort of think Bush is doing a good job, but not nearly as intensely. And specifically, do the Democrats need some sort of national platform like the Republican contract with America to run on? I would say yes, but there is first, it's a historical issue. I wrote that, and George Stephanopoulos said, the contract with America had nothing to do with the Republicans winning in '94. That's a myth. And I didn't know what to say to him.
Well, here's a story on '94. It is an interesting story. Down at the White House, when we first learned about the contract with America, we had a spirited debate about how to respond to it. And I was of the view, as were some others, that we ought to try to rebut the contract with ideas of our own. When we ran in '92, Clinton put out a whole book of ideas, and he wasn't the only one. Ross Perot had done the same. Paul Tsongas had done the same. It was pretty clear that voters wanted to get it in writing and wanted to know what you stood for. But congressional Democrats and a lot of Democratic strategists at the time thought that it would be a more effective strategy to trash the contract. So when the contract came out, the Democratic response in '94 was to attack it. That it was that it cut Medicare, that it cut Medicaid, to make a whole bunch of attacks that were sort of familiar attacks from going after Reagan in the '80s.
Right.
And it had the perverse effect of making the contract seem more real than it would otherwise been, and more crucially, making Democrats seem like we were defending the status quo rather than competing with Republicans on how to change it. And that was a disastrous mistake on our part. I'm not sure that voters, how many voters read the contract, but they had no doubt which party was the party of change going into that election. So what does that tell you for 2006? First off, it suggests that the Republicans' current strategy of not having a national agenda, of trying to localize all the elections and of trying to do everything they can not to have any issues to point to, if that remains their strategy, is probably a mistake.
But they've since gerrymandered the difference between '94 is that now the Republicans have gerrymandered the country.
We'll get to that in a moment. For Democrats, it's always better to make an election about something than to just assume that you're going to win it on your opponent's failures. So I think that it's important for Democrats to put ideas on the table. We don't have to do it in a monolithic, 200 members of challengers on the steps of the Capitol kind of way. But if we want to make this election about change, we'd better be for some of it. And I think that's the spirit that most of the challengers are running in, and really that's what matters most. I think that now as you said, it's a slightly different political landscape in that even if there's a national tide this time, it's hard to imagine that it's going to, that it's going to sweep in 53 new members. There probably aren't even 53 seats within reach. But Republicans are definitely scared, and they'd have to be. When you're running 15 points down in generic head-to-head polls, as they are now, that gives you all kinds of heartburn, and because of those polls considerably overstate who's likely to show up, and it's probably more like half that right now, half that margin.
Right.
But nonetheless, look at DeLay's own decision to withdraw. That's that's a sign that redistricting, even when you write your own lines, you're going to end up with some members who are vulnerable to a bad national tie.
Well, especially if you maximize the number of your advantage, then you're going to have to reach it.
Yeah, somebody's going to have to.
Some 55% districts you might actually lose.
Right.
But suppose the Democrats decided, hey, we want our version of a contract with America. We at least want some things we're going to tell the voters we're going to do if we get in power. What would that be, and could they ever get together to do that?
Well, as I said, I think it is. It's a mistake for everybody to kind of stand together and say kumbaya, because what always happens when you do that, unless you have a long time in the embittered backbenches to seed about what you would do, as Gingrich did, is that you end up with a bunch of incumbents trying to outline an ambitious platform for change, and even if you get them to agree on something, something bold, it might not be seen as something bold, because change usually comes from the hinterlands, not from the halls of power. So I think it's kind of more important for the challengers who are running to come up with to be as ambitious and as they can be in outlining, how they would change the rules of Congress, what kind of problems they would tackle, what they would do to.
But then you're not going to have a nationalized election, and isn't your former partner in crime, Rahm Emanuel, trying to cobble together a national platform?
Well, he and I are working on a book together that will come out in September. That we hope will have some ideas in it that would be of use to Democrats in the country over the long haul. But I think Democrats will succeed in nationalizing the election. I think that the challenge will be to show the country that. Or to give the country a good sense of what we might do if we did win, and that doesn't necessarily have to mean, 20 things that we reverse overnight. But I think it's important to have a few, and
right.
It's especially important to have some in the area of kind of where this Congress has gone awry in terms of
which is where,
well, feathering its own nest and overspending and also just kind of botching domestic affairs generally. So I think what voters are in the mood for is a short list of tangible ideas that sound like.
Right.
They could actually get done, and the one thing about running against these Republicans is that we have an awful lot of problems to choose from.
Right. Actually, come to think of it, hasn't every midterm election since '94 been nationalized? I mean, the '98 one was all about impeachment.
Ones, 98, 94, 98, 2002 were all nationalized.
Yeah, 2002 was all about national security and 9/11, and so this idea that you can get away with a local election may be insane.
Well, it's like saying that in 1974 that you could make it a national election. That you could make it a local election that you weren't, even though you were a Republican incumbent, you weren't in any way associated with what had gone on in Washington in the years before.
Right.
The voters are skeptical. The press is very skeptical.
I just think maybe the media landscape has changed so that more people are clued into the one big national conversation and paying less attention to what their local guy is really doing.
I think that
than it was when they got all their information from the local paper.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think that the other reason that you get a national election often is when things are in bad shape in a whole lot of places. I mean, sometimes an election is quirky because the Florida economy is doing well and the Ohio economy is in bad shape. And here you've got enough problems that are problems everywhere that you just don't have a lot of voters who are going to the polls in a great mood.
Right. Okay, well, let's move on to our third topic, which is one of these things people want something done about, which is health care. And the big news was Mitt Romney's plan in Massachusetts, which is nearly universal health care. Romney, of course, is a Republican, and that he would champion a reform scheme that promised near universal health care is considered sort of a go-to-China feather in his cap. Obviously it's a good thing, but I have some thoughts about where it might go awry, but I was wondering what you thought of it.
Yeah, I think it's a good thing. I think that anytime Democrats and Republicans get together and tackle a problem this big in a comprehensive way is a good thing. And there are elements of it that do seem to bring together best thinking on both sides. I've always liked the idea of an individual mandate.
We should define what individual mandate is. It means everybody's required to have health insurance the way drivers are required to have auto insurance.
That's right. That requiring people to cover themselves and their children is an important thing. But that at the same time, you need to make sure that they can pay for it.
Right. It's an idea Joe Klein pushed, and despite that, I revel in it. I'm happy that it succeeded.
Well, it was if Republicans in '93 and '94, if Republicans had been willing to reach agreement, that was where we could potentially have reached agreement. There was a lot of over expectations on the Democratic side and desire to stop everything on the Republican side, but that was the potential compromise that was on the table, if only for a brief period. Now, the challenge in Massachusetts is going to be how to pay for it, and the reason that they were able to pass this is that they sort of punted that issue down the road. They have an unusual circumstance in that they have a lot of money already in the kitty that they can use for this, and then they set it up saying that employers with more than 10 employees have to cover it, but if they don't, they can just pay $295 and people will get coverage anyway. And as you know, health insurance costs about $10,000 a family, so $295 a year is not going to.
So why aren't employers going to start bailing out of their health plans by the thousands and dumping all their employees on the public system, which will then have to subsidize them and go broke?
I think there's a risk of that. I think there's certainly a risk that for small businesses who are the ones who are, for the most part, not covering people, that they look at it and for them, the economics haven't changed a whole lot. They face a choice between, do we pay $6,000 or $8,000 or $10,000 a year for each of our employees, or do we pay $295? And a lot of them will want to do the right thing and won't want to pay $295 for getting nothing. But still, if you're running a dry cleaner with 15 employees and your margin is pretty slim, I think you're exactly right that there's a risk that they won't do that, and so I think we're going to see in a year or two, as the bills pile up, that this ends up costing a heck of a lot more, and that doesn't necessarily mean that it'll fall apart. Massachusetts could figure out how to pay for it some other way. Although
Dukakis had a scheme in '88 that did fall apart.
Yeah, I think there's a long, and Romney has had because the $295 is charging employers anything is a kind of inconvenient fact for him to take into the Republican primaries. He's said, well, maybe lower it or get rid of it, or it doesn't really matter.
Well, I think he said he's going to line item veto it with the full knowledge that the legislature is going to override it. Yeah. So it's a kabuki dance they're going through.
His view is that he'll be out of there before the foundation
Right.
starts to crumble.
But
But on the other hand, it is so it's so rare that you see progress on healthcare that the
Right.
prospect of even people getting together and passing something that's going to have to be rebuilt in a couple of years is better
Right.
than what we're used to.
Isn't it sort of a good thing in the long term if employers stop offering health insurance? The whole problem is that we have this ridiculous system where we provide health insurance through employers, so you're locked into your job. So if you don't have a job, you're in deep trouble, as opposed to linking healthcare to just being a human being and needing healthcare.
Yeah, I think if you were if you're starting from scratch, you wouldn't design an employer system. But the problem that everybody comes into in this debate is that you got to find the money somewhere, and you could have a scheme that was totally detached from employers, but then you'd have to you'd still have to charge somebody to pay for the insurance, and it's not clear. It's not clear who we have unless you'll let us bring in a whole bunch more immigrants. Who we have to stick that bill on, because employers have been the deepest pocket, but they're about maxed out, and individuals. I mean, nobody's going to be able to afford $10,000 a year coverage, whether you require them to or not, and we can kind of socialize the risk and make the government figure out how to pay for it, pay for it from other sources, but that's 5 or 10%. 5 or 10% VAT or something. It's not that's not an easy thing for America to absorb either.
But this raises a second issue, which is the standard liberal democratic approach has been single payer, have the government do it. My attitude has always been Medicare works fine. Figure out what's wrong with Medicare, fix it, and extend it to the rest of the population, and that's the best solution. Instead, this Romney scheme requires people to buy insurance from private insurers, so there's that extra layer, which is then subsidized by the government, so that this layer of private insurance companies in between. The Republicans say they'll be more efficient. I tend to think, A, they're going to try to screw you by denying you treatment when you need it, and B, it's an extra layer of selling and advertising and private sector paperwork that makes the whole system less efficient, and that probably outweighs any efficiencies that the private sector will achieve.
Well, I think that there is. Those are all good points. It comes down to the fact that we start out spending $5,200 per person on health care, which is more than twice as much as any other industrialized country, and it's an awful lot of the debate is around. Should we have a single payer system? Should we have Medicare? Should we have private insurers? But the administrative efficiencies you can get from any of those schemes, if they behave the way that their proponents argue, still doesn't get you down to what any other nation would consider affordable health care. So there's just a whole lot.
But we're never going to get down to that. In fact, our health care bill is going to go up, and it should go up. I want when I get old, I want super, or even before then, super expensive life-saving treatments. I don't care if 50% of the gross national product goes to health care. Health care is really important, and if we put all our 50% of our minds to work making us healthier and live longer, I think that's a good thing. It's more important than buying more cosmetics and cars.
Right, but I guess the thing that you should be most worried about is not kind of who's running the show, because I suspect was muddled along in that regard. It's more what can we do to make the system structured so that it actually gets results, and do you end up in a system where doctors and hospitals get paid more on the basis of of what kind of outcomes they get instead of just how many procedures they do. I think there is a way to to get better quality, more efficiency over the long haul. But as you say, there are plenty of incentives in the system that interfere with that. And I think, I think it would be a great thing to have some states experiment with some big different approaches, so
right.
We could see, how we've really only had a couple of experiments. Hawaii did one that didn't work.
It's a lot harder with healthcare than welfare reform because you're affecting the entire population instead of a small subpopulation.
Yeah, and you have enormous commercial interests involved.
Yeah, and if you tax your businesses to pay for it, then you've put your state out of business in comparison with the state next door.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. But you have enough states that are paying top dollar already, like Massachusetts, where it'd be worth a few more experiments like this. And we could be in a situation where in a couple of years, the businesses of America come to Washington and plead for mercy and say, we don't care what you do, just give us take this burden off our backs.
Isn't it? I'm sneaking this question on you, but you probably don't want to answer it. But isn't Hillary the last person in America who can raise this issue and run on it? Does she have the?
No, I don't think that's
what's the word? Does she have the cojones to run on it for president, having been associated with this magnificent failure?
Well, look, she has done a lot of work on healthcare as a senator, and she's not shied away from the issue in the slightest. In fact, she makes the point that that she's learned a lot from that whole experience, and she's got some of the most interesting ideas out there. She did something with Gingrich. She did something with Frist, and she just knows an enormous amount about the issue. So I think that the important thing for anybody on either side of the aisle on this issue is to approach from a practical standpoint and to lay out a pragmatic, sensible plan, not just get in a bidding war of promises, which is what often happens in politics. And in the 2004 primaries, Dick Gephardt started off by offering a $2 trillion health care plan, and the other candidates were looking over their shoulders as they came in at $900, $800, $700 billion. And I think that, it is I think that Americans are eager to see some actual progress on this, and kind of disappointed in what they've seen out of Washington. I mean, even the layups have been hard on this issue for Washington. I mean, the Patients' Bill of Rights, which both Gore and Bush practically shook hands on it in the 2000 debates, and McCain worked out a compromise with Democrats and handed it to the White House, and the White House thought about it and decided no thanks. And that was an incredibly modest piece of legislation that didn't cost anything.
What's the Patients' Bill of Rights? I forget.
You remember the Patients' Bill of Rights? It was an effort to make sure that doctors got to make medical decisions.
It was like an against heartless
Correct.
HMO bureaucratic cost cutters.
Right. But it just gives you an idea that even when there's 300 votes in the House of Representatives for something, it's still hard to get to the finish line on this issue.
Right. We can thank the Founding Fathers for that. Thank you. You're one of the few people who's actually gotten something done. And so you're one of my heroes.
Well, you too, Mickey.
let's do this again. This is fun.
Well, thanks for having me. We'll get together and talk about the 10th anniversary of welfare reform sometime.
Well, and I will try to pin you to the wall and embarrass you by mentioning the names of actual presidential candidates that you won't want to express anything but a favorable opinion of.
Fair enough.
Okay.
Take care.
Look forward to it. See ya.
Thanks, Mickey.
Bye.